So I am going to close this off, I'm going to take us on a little bit of a journey, a little bit different than what we've talked about so far. And I'll talk a bit about the future. I'm actually going to start talking just a little bit about the past. So the web is about 25 years old. It's actually just a little bit older than that. But it was conceived about 25 years ago. And as we know, this man is thought up by an Englishman. Now, the thing is, he didn't work alone. Nobody ever works alone, really, when it comes right down to it. So the concept, the initial concept, was revised with the help of Robert Caillot, a Belgian computer scientist, that he was working with, and they were working at CERN. As it turns out, though, they were actually on the French side of the border, which some French people have lovely pointed out on the internet that, haha, it was actually the French side, because the buildings kind of overlap the border. But there was also kind of a North American element. The first website was hosted on a computer designed in California, as you know now quite often here. And it was a Next box at that point, but this was where the first website was hosted. And then, of course, they were at CERN, which technically was in Switzerland. So we had this kind of multicultural, multi-nation element to it, but still kind of centered around a couple countries, a couple regions for sure. And so if you look into the future a little bit, 15 years later, we're kind of around the year 2000. We've got the big dot-com bubble that's about to burst. We've got all these big companies that suddenly disappear. And the makeup of the internet at that point, the number of people who were using it and where they came from, it kind of mirrors those people who started things off, right? Who kicked things off. You had people from North America, 30% out of North America were using the web, and then you had Europe in about equal numbers. Japan and Korea were the other two big groups, and then everyone else was really, really quite small. And you had countries such as, or continents such as Africa, where there was almost nobody online at all. And so these were all developed economies, really. It was the developed economies that got there first. And if you look at the brands that were coming out of it, the big mega companies that kind of grew out of it, again, all developed economies, most of them North American, quite a bit from Korea and Japan as well. And so that was the Alexa top 10 back then. If you look at today, actually the situation is quite different, and it's changing quite rapidly, becoming even more different in some ways. So this gives us an idea of the internet penetration right now. So it's nearing saturation in developed economies. So that on the map, you've got the areas that are darkest. So the red, you've got the UK, Germany, Netherlands, and so on in Europe. And then most of the rest of Europe is still pretty dark. You've got USA, which actually, the penetration is actually lower than in some parts of Europe. And then again, you've got Japan and Korea over on the side, and everything else is much lower. And some regions are even less than 20% internet penetration. Big regions, like China and India, places with really large populations, Indonesia, Brazil, Russia. And internet penetration is still quite low. When you look at it from the business side point of view, you start to look at Alexa. In this case, it's the top 20. But you've got almost half of the Alexa top 20 that's actually coming from now emerging economies, predominantly China. But again, you've got Russia, you've got India starting to creep in. And if you go a little bit further, you see, again, there's quite a bit coming out of emerging economies. So where we're at the moment is we've got about 3 billion people that have yet to use the internet. And this map shows income levels worldwide. And as you see, it kind of mirrors what we just saw with internet usage. High internet usage is that group in blue. It mirrors it quite well, is the countries with higher incomes, in regions with higher incomes. And then the lower the incomes, chances are no one's using the web. And so we've got this big group that's still left to come online. And until fairly recently, it was kind of still a bit of an open question of when this would happen. I mean, there's an awful lot of people that needed to be connected. But what's become increasingly obvious is that they're all going to be online quite soon, and it's thanks to devices such as this. This is really what's going to do it. First of all, mobile phones in general, portable computing in general, but really, if you kind of want to look at an archetype of what will people be using, especially this next couple billion, it would be a device such as this. Now, this is from a company called Xiaomi in China, and this company didn't exist about 4 years ago. It just kind of came out of nowhere. And it has a model a little bit similar to Amazon in that it it makes devices, but that's not really the primary thing it does. It actually sells media, and it sells books and movies and music and things like that. It sells devices to get people into the ecosystem. I guess Apple kind of does that too, except Apple makes a huge profit on its devices. Xiaomi has more of the Amazon strategy where they give the devices away, so to speak. So the devices don't cost very much, but they're actually really nice. I mean, in some ways, one of the differences is that, Amazon's Fire devices, some people like them, some people don't, but they're not really very exciting devices. Whereas Xiaomi has turned into this giant brand, not just in China, it's now moving into Southeast Asia, moving into India, and it's got a huge following. They use Android, which means that they have a platform they can just kind of use. They've somewhat forked Android, so they've got a completely different skin on it, very different interactions, but still completely compatible with all Android applications. And the application, or the OS, is crowdsourced, so people get to suggest features, and then they actually build them in, and you get updates every week. And so it's a completely different way of looking at a device. Basically, every week you've got new stuff right from the people who make it. And so the neat thing, though, is, this device was €100, and this was actually 2 years ago. The prices just keep going down and down and down. There's a lot of devices that are even at the €50 price point. There's some that are starting to appear even towards the €20 price point. And obviously, the lower you go, these devices aren't necessarily very good, but they're still kind of good enough. They've got a pretty high resolution display. They've got a battery that lasts in some ways no worse than anyone else's battery. And they still have a same operating system as everybody else, and they have sensors and all that. So this is how a lot of people are coming online, and this is why it's going to happen much more quickly. What I'm going to discuss today, though, primarily is what kind of internet are these people actually going to find? Because for the moment, we're used to kind of the way things operate in developed economies in the West. In some ways, we built the internet, but the internet that's being discovered by people coming online in emerging economies is actually pretty different in ways that aren't always immediately obvious if you haven't been to those countries or spent time kind of looking at how these things are working out. So to start off, I will begin the story by talking about sheep. And the reason I'm talking about sheep is that in Kuwait, there are sheep for sale on Instagram. And so this is something that's kind of happened in Kuwait, not just the sheep part, but the Instagram part, the selling things on Instagram. It's kind of crept up over the last year or so. And this is a series of quotes from a recent article on the subject. And, the lady's just saying, if you have an Instagram account, you just slap a tag on something, you take a picture of it, and you put it on Instagram, and you just sell it. And so everyone's just kind of doing this. So she says even her grandmother has an Instagram business, and she sells dried fruit on Instagram, and her cousin is doing these kind of artisanal potted plant things. So people are kind of hacking these little businesses together with a platform that they found for some other reason, but that's become really useful for them. And Instagram in particular is really popular in Kuwait, and specifically there's stores like this that are popping up quite a bit. But Instagram is not at all the only platform that's being kind of hacked and reused that way. So as an example, in Thailand, there's over 10,000 similar businesses that are powered entirely by Facebook. And some of these are pretty big. You look at this person, they've got 74,000 followers. That's not exactly insignificant by any stretch, really, for just somebody selling stuff on Facebook. And what these businesses are starting to kind of do is they're giving us a glimpse of this new kind of entirely digital, in kind of mobile-fueled, informal businesses. And the term informal economy has been used for quite some time by economists, sociologists, and so on to kind of describe these small ad hoc businesses that basically the world has had for many hundreds, and in some ways, for as long as there's been people, there's been ad hoc businesses like this, little businesses that spring out of nothing. And most people on the planet still work in businesses like this, right? Most people do not go to an office and work for a person. They probably work for themselves in this capacity. Except these businesses, again, they're just as ad hoc, but they're still completely different. And to give a feeling of kind of the contrast here, just to be clear as well, when I say she's selling on Facebook, it's similar to the Instagram. There's no shopping cart. There's no Facebook marketing manager person that they go to and that they make some sort of deal with or anything like that. They just put up a page, an account, and they start putting things on it. And they provide a means of contact, Facebook being obviously the first means of contact, but phone number, instant messaging applications. Usually they use many different means, but they're all social and they're all mobile. And then they just sell stuff. They find an audience, and the audience contacts them, and they ship it something up, and then they send it off. And when you see the, kind of how the whole transaction works, you start to see that even though they're still pretty ad hoc, they're also actually pretty sophisticated, right? I mean, on the right over here, you see courier tracking numbers, right? So it's not as if this isn't kind of an old-fashioned kind of business. It's actually still a very modern business, but operating in this weird kind of middle ground of old and new and very simple and then pretty sophisticated. And the reason all of this is happening, the reason people can just kind of grab these platforms and use them for stuff, is that they're not, they don't offer this beautiful, great experience. At least they don't offer that great experience of shopping. But they're good enough, and they have this good balance where they give people a really wide reach. In the case of Facebook, for example, about 80% of the Thai internet population uses Facebook. So, if you want to reach Thai people, Facebook is a pretty good way to do it. So you've got the reach. The effort for everybody involved is really low. Again, everybody has Facebook. It's really easy to post messages, really easy to get notifications. There's this whole system that kind of helps you reach people very quickly. The functionality for all parties is not too bad, and it's really adaptable. You can kind of do things with it, and it works on every single device. So also, it doesn't matter if your audience is really affluent or is just some person on the street who has their first phone, they can probably use Facebook. And the vendor herself, she could have the smallest phone and she could still use Facebook. So it creates this really neat environment. And in the case of emerging economies in particular, it fills a really important gap that we don't necessarily think about too much, again, in developed markets. And what you find, in the case of Facebook, this particular example, is that the largest growth of these types of pages that have these little micro businesses, they occur in parts of the country where the population is underserved by brick and mortar shops, so in the countryside. And they feel kind of this need of being able to buy anything you might buy in Bangkok in some ways, but you're buying it from the countryside. So that's kind of one need that it fills, and it would be really easy to say, okay, well, these businesses are good for people who have less money, who live out in the country, and who can't come to the city, and it fills kind of this demographic, and that's really good. But that would be kind of missing kind of the other half of the audience, and to understand that, we're going to take a look at China. Because rural populations are one thing, but China has an entirely different problem, or opportunity, depending on how you look at it. So China has 14 cities with populations over 5 million. And again, to put this in perspective, in Europe there's one. And then you move down a little bit, and there's 41 cities in China with a population of more than 2 million. Again, in Europe there are 6. So there are big cities almost everywhere in China. Nothing is not a big city. And if you looked at the cities, of 1 million, you'd probably have another number of 50 or 60 of them. It's just really substantial numbers. Everything is big. And so you also have a middle class that's growing at a rate of about 80,000 people a day. Every day there are new people who can afford something substantially different from what they could afford maybe the month before or certainly the year before. So it's creating these interesting opportunities, but also these challenges, because on the one hand, you want to reach the rural population, which is great. 600 million rural residents, really important to reach them, and the internet can help do that. But the flip side of that is you have 700 million urban residents, and just reaching them can be a bit of a challenge because, again, the cities are so big. You can't open a store in every city, let alone open a store in all sorts of parts of every city. It just doesn't work at the same scale as it does here, where you might have a high street in Düsseldorf and you put a shop and everybody can get to it. I mean, here you can't rely on that. So for many Chinese people, shopping online isn't so much kind of the electronic version of commerce. It is commerce, and increasingly also using their mobile to do this, to shop, isn't just kind of the modern special new alternative to using a PC or to going to the high street. It's their primary and sometimes their only means of using the internet. Now, another thing that's different, and again, quite different from how we've developed in the West, and again, this has historical roots. I mean, almost everything happens for a reason. When you just kind of look for the reason, you often find it, even though you might think it's a business model thing, but usually there's older reasons for that. So when you look at, and this is an example from North America, but Europe is very similar. Most online retail involves dealing with individual merchants, right? So you deal with usually large brands. You might go online and shop at H&M or a German retailer bookstore, or even a small German company. You might go and shop online directly with them. But that's because Europe and North America have this huge ecosystem, again, of retail, big companies, small companies, filling the cities, there's all these businesses. In China, a lot of online retail is sold through marketplaces. And the way these marketplaces work is that they're very much, again, they mirror kind of what you had before. They haven't had a chance to kind of urbanize yet. They're urbanizing really quickly. So the model that's predominant, in some ways makes sense, is the public market, which is what we had in Europe, much longer ago, and is starting to disappear over here. So you've got a big marketplace where buyers and sellers can come together and find each other. So it's a modern version of the old markets. And the largest marketplace of this kind is a company called Alibaba. They have a variety of marketplaces. One of the biggest ones is Tmall. Now, Tmall is really interesting. It has about 200 million customers. It has about 150,000 merchants. And what it handles are well-known brands. So again, instead of Nestle or Philips or Braun opening a store on the internet, they would put their store on Tmall, and people would go just to Tmall, and then they would look at all the different things. It's like going to a department store, basically, but it's all entirely virtual. And especially for large brands, what the brands do is they're charged an entry fee, and then they're also charged a commission. So, and the entry fee ensures that it's major brands that go in, so you don't get this hodgepodge of different kinds. You have to be a fairly legitimate large brand. And then you're charged a commission as well for every sale. But what the brands get in return is they get this super high visibility, high traffic, really customizable, and it's kind of filled with different inputs and outputs to social media, and it's very mobile optimized as well. And they get basically this whole package that makes it worth their while to be in these marketplaces. And the customization in particular is quite extensive. I mean, it's not like an Amazon shop where you get to put a picture and you put some metadata, and that's kind of all you get. There's entire companies that specialize in making sites inside of Tmall for brands, and they're quite sophisticated. There's carousels, there's all sorts of things that kind of make it feel more like the brand, but it still operates inside of this site. And so for major brands, certainly brands overseas, that are entering the Chinese market, hosting a virtual storefront in Tmall, it's sometimes the better alternative than actually trying to open lots of shops. So last year, Apple opened a shop on Tmall, and recently, I think one of the more interesting ones is that Amazon now has a shop on Tmall. So, I mean, that just gives you an idea of the reach and the legitimacy of this is basically where everybody goes. So that's big brands. Now, then the second site is called Taobao, and Taobao is consumer to consumer, but it's also small business to consumer. So it kind of handles everything that the other one doesn't. And the model is a little bit different. You don't pay an entry fee because that would be onerous for really small businesses. They want people to be able to just quickly spin up a business. But then you pay for advertising to try to get people to come to your particular page, your particular site. And so it's a little bit like eBay, but one of the neat things is that vendors aren't limited to selling physical things. What they can do is just offer all sorts of services as well. So as an example, this is a Chinese travel agent, a fairly large one from the looks of it, and they sell package tours and airline tickets and things like that through Taobao, but they also sell all sorts of other random things. If you look over there, they're giving you, I think there's a MiFi. If you want to travel to Thailand, you can get your little MiFi to get a connectivity. In the middle, you have some Thai SIM cards. The one on the right there I quite like is your Thai tourist visa. You can get it through Taobao, through the travel agent. You can get your transportation, you get subway passes. I mean, basically whatever it makes sense to offer, but it's just all done entirely online. So what you have is this kind of mixture of kind of half Amazon, half eBay, a bit of Google, and then PayPal, which is a bit we'll talk about in a second. You get just this beautiful hodgepodge of all this functionality that makes these sites kind of the obvious destination. And really, it's hard to underestimate, or to kind of, you can easily underestimate how important these are. I mean, these sites enable Chinese consumers to access a range of products that normally they might not have access to, especially all the people in the countryside, but even people in second and third tier cities, some of the smaller 2 million people cities. And you can buy everything. You can buy cars. All the car companies have storefronts on Tmall. And you can buy very expensive cars. Again, it's not just shopping for everyday things. I mean, it runs the whole gamut, basically. You can buy a Lamborghini on the internet. So On the opposite side of that, I mean, the reason, again, that this has grown so much is that it's become such a pervasive ecosystem, and it's giving people all sorts of opportunities that didn't exist before. So this is from an article about owning a Taobao shop, and what the person is saying is that it's become almost a national pastime. People just, again, I mean, I use the term spin up a business, but that's almost what it is. It's kind of like spinning up a GitHub account or something of the sort that we're quite used to doing. You open a Dropbox folder, so you open a Taobao shop and you put some stuff on it, and you build a little bit of an audience, you start selling things. It's easy, it's social, everybody's doing it, and it provides extra income, and it provides people with different skills that they might not have had. And so everybody in their spare time starts to do it, and then, a lot of people in the cities kind of do it as a pastime thing, but again, what's really important is that in the countryside, it's brought this huge wave of people, not just online to shop, but also online to do business. So there's millions of new jobs that have been created from, small tradespeople in little villages, people who might do woodworking, or they might sell there's some organic vegetables being sold online, there's all sorts of beauty products, people who just make things and are now able to access basically the whole Chinese audience. As a matter of fact, Taobao and Alibaba, they actually have an initiative that I thought was really neat, where they go out into the countryside, they find a village of a reasonable population where they think they can put internet connectivity easily. They set up the internet, they give them a bunch of computers, they find one or two people who either have some internet skills or they train them, and they say, you are the Alibaba person in the village. And within months, it basically creates this virtuous circle where people start buying things, they use those things to maybe start a business, and they use the business to then buy a computer, and then it just goes round and round and round, and before you know it, you've got all these internet-enabled businesses in a city or a small town that maybe didn't have the internet 6 months ago. And it creates real benefits. So, statistically, there's over 1 million Tmall and Taobao stores that are registered in rural areas, and that's been a really significant change. So that was China, and when you think about all the reasons why this has evolved in China, it makes sense that it would potentially happen in other places. One of the markets that's probably the most obvious is Africa. So this is a brand called Jumia that operates on the African subcontinent. It's actually a European brand, I believe, to begin with, but it operates entirely in Africa. And they have a very similar problem, right? So they were talking, I think this is a quote regarding Nigeria specifically, but this adapts to a lot of different markets in Africa. There's 3 malls for 20 million inhabitants. I mean, how can you possibly service that many people with that number of shopping centers? So it's a good time, and it's in some ways the only obvious thing to do is to leapfrog over the whole concept of offline and just do everything online, and that's really it. So the other thing that's happening that's kind of neat, I mean, so you've got people in emerging economies that have all these benefits from this kind of model that's occurring, but because the world is big and global, and you put something online and you really just don't know who's going to see it, what's starting to happen is it's cross-pollinating in both directions. So the first thing that's happening is that Alibaba, because you can sell all sorts of things on Alibaba, you're starting to have Western consumers that are coming in that direction. This was an example, a case study from Etsy. And so Etsy has lots and lots of micro businesses, but they are primarily in North America and Europe. And this lady in California, she has a business where she sets these little kits up where you can order cake decorating supplies for children's birthday parties, little flowers and things that you put on cakes. And she gets all of her stock from China. She orders it on Alibaba, and it's enabled her to grow her business in ways that she's given her access to just huge amounts of products that she didn't have access to in North America, but she sells them on Etsy, probably entirely to North Americans or Europeans. Turn that around, this is a business in the province of Guangzhou, which is just on the opposite side of Hong Kong. It's a small 5-person business. It's a family, basically. There's a tailor, a designer, a couple other people who work for them, and they design clothes. They get models to pose for them. They really nice photography, which brings people in. And their model is that you take your measurements at home, you send them your measurements on Etsy, and a couple weeks later, you get a custom-made piece of clothing. And so, they're going in the other direction. They've got the scale of being in China, of having access to all sorts of resources and people who know how to make things, but then they're reaching Western consumers. So these things are really starting to blend, and I think we're going to see them blend an awful lot more. And part of it is that the world is so global. I mean, in some ways, for all the things we hear about, in some ways, consumers on the other side of the world, sometimes they're actually more lucky than we are because they get this noise coming from North America and Europe of all these brands and all these products. And they're just as interested in some of them as we are. And so even when a brand hasn't moved into Asia yet, sometimes, especially in China, you'll find people who are in North America who find goods that they know are in demand in China and they ship them over and then they put them on Alibaba. And so Chinese consumers have access to them. And you'll often find stories of brands who are completely shocked to realize their things are already for sale in China, just not for sale by them. So it's creating this really interesting movement of goods and ideas, but it's also creating this new kind of this almost highly globalized consumer who's often they're digital first. They discover things online, and they live in one region, but they shop or they seek out products from in the rest. So we've talked about marketplaces, and the marketplace model is definitely very interesting, but one of the things that we often talk about is the amount of noise on the internet in general. How do you find things? And certainly the marketplace model does create a bit of that problem. I mean, how do you find things when there's a giant marketplace with millions of products on it? So here's a little bit of a case study it's not mine, I found this on the internet, and the credits are at the bottom. All the slides are online if you want to have a look. And so this is Jing. This is an affluent young Chinese girl. She started blogging about her life and her beauty style while she was abroad in the UK. And if you're a brand, a fashion brand, Jing is in some ways your competitor because she's also a marketer. She has a microblog on Weibo, which is the version of a somewhat version of Twitter in China. It's a little bit different, but it's generally the same thing. She has 28,000 followers. She blogs every day. She posts things on Pinterest. She has an Instagram account. But what she does as well is she's a retailer. She has a Taobao shop, and she puts products on there that match some of the things that she's been wearing. She has these flash sales, and it takes her a couple hours to sell out. And so she's built an entire business entirely online off of social media. And in her case, she's kind of crafted this herself. She's piecemeal found all sorts of services, and then she uses Taobao to do the transaction. But it leads to an interesting kind of insight as to how do people discover things, because she's kind of become a brand who promotes other stuff. So there are sites that are developing in China that help to address this. They're called online shopping neighborhoods is kind of the unofficial term. And what they do is they help curate these millions and millions of products so that people can actually find things. So when you first see them, they kind of look a little bit like Pinterest because basically anybody who wants can make an account and they can start posting pictures of things. And you help to develop an audience. People like what you post, people will follow you, and so on. So it's entirely created and fueled by social media, and it helps people to explore different choices of items. Where you'll start to see the big difference, though, because at first you see, it kind of looks like Pinterest, so okay, that's great, but why is this really important? So here's an example of one of the sites in China, one of the bigger ones with about 30 million users, and the big difference really is that people post all of this stuff, and then when you click on something that you like, the company gets a cut. So the model is very similar to an online travel agent like a Trivago or Skyscanner. They're basically offering an environment where people can find things. In their case, it's user-generated, whereas sites like Trivago do it on their own. But they get a small piece of the business for all of the outbound links. And with a market like China, you get 5 to 6 million outbound clicks a day. And so these actually turn into viable businesses. But also from the consumer perspective, it helps you find things. Now, one of the reasons that this is working so well in China is that social media is really, really big. And this is something that we're finding in all emerging economies. They seem to have a very similar pattern that's a bit different from us. So over here on the right, you have emerging, or you have developed markets rather. So you've got Europe, North America, Japan, Korea. And these are countries where there's really high internet penetration. And the usage of social media, it's okay. I mean, some markets where they don't use it quite as much, others more. But basically, we're all kind of online, and a lot of us are using social media. But what you find in developing markets is that you have markets where, for example, only 20% of people are online, but all of them basically are on social media. And that's what's kind of happening, is everyone is going straight to social. They get their first computer, which for all intents and purposes is a phone. They probably get a Facebook account or a WhatsApp account or a Weibo account or so on, and they're almost immediately using social media. And so, in China in particular, social media is just massive. I mean, this is just part of the ecosystem. It's not just one or two sites. It's just this huge whole network. But what's starting to happen also in a lot of countries that we're just starting to see it now in some ways, even with Facebook's recent announcements about some of the stuff they're doing. But social media services in China, they are really bona fide platforms in much further than anything we've seen in the West so far. So one of the most popular ones, and it's only been around for a few years, but it's grown substantially, is called WeChat. And WeChat is entirely mobile. There is no desktop anything, really. And it has about 500 million daily users. And just to give you an idea of the scale, I mean, this is, if anyone's familiar with this gentleman on the right, his name is Hugo Barra. He was VP of Android for many years at Google, and he was hired away by Xiaomi, who made that phone we saw at the beginning, to help grow the market in Asia. And so he went from Silicon Valley to China, and he was like, whoa, everybody is on WeChat. And he's like, nobody uses email, they don't use the phone, they don't use SMS, everybody is on WeChat. It's how everybody communicates. And the reason that it just basically has monopolized people's lives in some ways is that although it does all the stuff that we're kind of used to, so it does text chatting and some group chatting, and you got some subscription stuff, and that sounds pretty normal still. It's kind of, you got a timeline, that's kind of normal, but it's the stuff at the bottom. So you've got a highly customizable API, you've got a payment platform, and a virtual wallet. And so what it creates is an environment where you have brands operating almost entirely inside of WeChat. And to give you an idea here, so these were a couple brands on the left that I subscribed to, and you can click on any of these and you get to their kind of page, which we've got an example in the middle. And along the bottom there, it's maybe a little bit hard to see, but you've got a little menu that opens all these options. Basically, it's like a mini website inside of WeChat, and that's the customizable API part. And they can build all these layers of functionality inside of their little WeChat bubble, so to speak. And there's all sorts of services. You can post information, obviously, the way you might on Facebook, but you can do all sorts of other stuff. On the right here is an example of, they have this kind of almost like an interactive voice kind of back and forth chat thing where, so I was at the Starbucks one and I typed what I was hoping said coffee, and then it answered a whole bunch of stuff back that I can't read. And then I typed in cappuccino, and then it gave me information about the recent cappuccino specials. And so you can just chat back and forth, basically, with this kind of virtual bot of the brand that gives you information. But all of this is something that we would normally do online, but is all being done inside of WeChat. And because there's a virtual wallet and a payment platform, it starts to become, really interesting for the brands. I mean, there's entire transactions being done. There's people selling airline tickets. There's people selling movie tickets. There's people doing all sorts of transactional stuff inside of WeChat because it's all bundled together. Now, Christian Heilmann was talking about the web, and a lot of people have talked about the web over the last few days, and we often talk about one web and preserving the web. There is no web here. I mean, this is all a platform, proprietary stuff on the inside. So on the one hand, it feels very much like basically China's just going to be using WeChat for everything. But on the other hand, there's some interesting things that are happening. And so it's interesting to see how these things progress, because on the one hand, they feel like, oh, it's all going to go in one direction. But then on the other side, it could actually be going completely the other way. So what's starting to happen is because everybody's mobile, mobile is becoming one of the most important touch points. And WeChat is only mobile. And so what brands are doing is they're saying, okay, well, all of my brand presence is on WeChat. How do I get people into WeChat? And so one of the things they do is they're creating these little sites called light apps, and you can kind of think of them as microsites, but they are mobile only. I mean, if you were to put them on a desktop computer, a lot of times you get this big pixelated, it's like you take a mobile site and you stretch it. And it's never meant to be on the desktop ever, because the idea is you see maybe a poster on the street, you scan the QR code, which I'll talk about in a second, you get to the site, they're really rich, you've got animation, they're using SVG, they're using tons of stuff, and they're really nice. They've got audio and all sorts of stuff, and basically your call to action is to go to WeChat, and then on WeChat you either spend money, subscribe to something, and so on. So it's just entirely mobile, but it's some of the most creative stuff I've seen on the web in a very long time, partially because they're constrained on the bottom end. They don't have to go any higher, so they in some ways they're just looking after mobile, which is really neat. So, I mentioned virtual platform or virtual wallets and mobile payment a little bit. And this is another example of, why is that happening over there, and why are we just kind of starting to see it here? Google Wallet didn't go very far, and Apple Pay is I think I heard a few days ago is only being used by 2 million people. I mean, these things are taking a lot of time over here. What happens in emerging economies, similar to the retail issue, is that there's no penetration in normal financial services, right? You've got countries in sub-Saharan Africa where only a quarter of adults have a formal bank account, or in Indonesia where only 15% of people have credit cards. So how do you do e-commerce without credit cards? So there's all these alternate systems that have evolved. So I'm just going to run through a couple of them really quickly, but just to give you a picture of how it's working, right? So you have M-Pesa, which you may have heard of because it's been operating for quite a long time, primarily in Africa, in West and East Africa, but it's also moving into India and the Philippines, and it's an entirely virtual bank. You can use it on your phone. You can use it on even the oldest, tiniest little feature phone, and you can send money, you can receive money, you can deposit money, you can pay bills for all sorts of things. You do it completely on your phone, no physical branch at all. Other things that are developing that we barely see at all anymore in Europe and certainly in North America is a lot of people pay cash on delivery. China, Nigeria, Indonesia, Russia, cash on delivery is really popular. So you buy something online and then you don't pay until it gets picked up. There's also ways to pay at your local bank. They give you a little thing and then you bring it into your bank. I mean, there's all sorts of different ways to get from the e-commerce to the payment point, but they sometimes take weird routes, whereas with us, we're just used to, you pay and that's it. And another interesting example is, again, when you think back to the marketplace model, so, if I go to the Philips website or the Braun website, I know I'm dealing with them, I have trust in them, everything's good, I'm probably wanting to put my credit card there because at least I don't have any fear of putting my credit card on their website. If you're dealing with a giant marketplace, you literally have a million vendors. How do you know who you can trust? So what is happening in China that's turned out to be, again, all these things kind of build on each other. So Alibaba, they realized very early on that they had all these vendors, and how were you going to establish this trust model? So what they did is they created kind of a virtual escrow system. So you go to Alibaba, you pay for something, and the money gets put in escrow until you receive the goods and you say, yeah, it's okay, these are fine. And then, of course, the vendor gets a star, and it creates this kind of trust model. But what it also does is it created this whole extra little segment of the economy where all of a sudden people were putting money into Alibaba and then holding it for a while and then doing things with it. And so, remember, Alibaba is huge. There's like 800 million people registered. So you have 800 million people who have the ability to put some money somewhere and then do something with it. And so they started doing all sorts of other things with it. So now it's turned into just a general payment system throughout China where you can pay for, they've got loans, they've got investments, you can pay for your phone bill, you can pay for hospital charges, tons of different things. It's just become kind of an alternate virtual payment, entirely due to the fact that everyone was using it anyway, so why not use it for other things? Now, so far we've been talking about actually fairly serious stuff. I mean, there's shopping and there's banking and there's insurance and things like that. There's an awful lot of really whimsical stuff also going on that's worth thinking about because, again, it's things that in the West we've skirted around these things. We've often built them, but for some reason we don't monetize them, which I find kind of strange sometimes. So this is YY. And YY is kind of like Google Hangouts is maybe the best way to explain it. It's big. There's 300 million people. There's millions of different channels. There's people singing, there's people doing karaoke, people having meetings, people doing educational things, teaching people things. Basically, it's kind of like a Google Hangout, except it has a virtual currency, because everything has a virtual currency in Asia, because why would you not have a virtual currency? So you can go on to YY, you can sing a song, you can give a course, and people follow, and what they give you are little gifts as you're talking, right? So people buy these little gifts for microcredits. I mean, they're little virtual gifts, or flowers and lollipops and little symbolic things. They cost almost nothing. But again, you have to think about the scale. So what ends up happening is people spend tiny amounts, they have lots of people they follow, but then the people who are really popular and who really build it up as a business, again, it's the idea if you take a business, you kind of spin it out of nothing because you have this ecosystem that lets you do it. And so there are karaoke singers making, 20,000 euro a month singing. There are people giving Photoshop lessons, making 100,000 euro a month. I can't even believe it every time I read it, giving Photoshop lessons. And just part of it is just the environment is there. And then there's, I mean, it's not just China either. I mean, a lot of these things, when you look around, you'll find analogs in other countries. In Korea, this guy runs around and eats noodles and eats kimchi every night, and apparently it makes lots of money doing it. So there's kind of a little bit for everyone, but that's what's so beautiful about it. And what really kind of binds it all together is mobile. I mean, none of this in some ways would be happening without mobile. If you think about a lot of these services, you have to be able to react really easily. You have to be able to be sitting on the subway and you're bored and your favorite whoever is on YY and you spend 20 minutes looking at them and you send them a couple flowers. All of that works because you can do it just in time. You can do it at 2 in the morning or at the office while you're supposed to be working. That's what keeps it going, is mobile. And so a lot of these businesses, WeChat, we said, was mobile only. They build mobile in right at the very beginning. They're not turning around a desktop thing and turning it into mobile, but not just from a layout perspective, from a business model perspective, all of the functionality is built in. So a really nice example in China that's turning out to be quite the driver of business is QR codes. WeChat entirely functions around QR codes. Every user has their own QR code. When you get an account, you have a section with your QR code. You can customize it, you can put a little picture on it, and that is your identity, basically. And so you can subscribe to any WeChat channel just by scanning one of these QR codes. So you walk down the street in China, and almost every shop has a WeChat QR code in the window, and you can just subscribe to stuff really, really, really quickly. And now, of course, I mean, Germany, actually, there's a lot of QR codes. I've been noticing that there's quite a few. In the UK, a little bit less. In North America, they absolutely loathe them and they think we're crazy. But in China, one of the things they've done for a long time now is they've put QR code readers everywhere. So you look at these are random apps. I mean, one of these is Taobao. The middle is a large travel brand called Qunar. This is the Baidu web browser that PPK would have mentioned a few days ago. All of these have a QR reader right there. So you're seconds away from any number of QR codes on your phone all the time. You never have to look for one. And that means that people just scan things. I mean, why not when the QR code reader is there? So using QR codes to interact, to transact, a lot of the stuff that's going on WeChat in terms of payments, you can go to Starbucks and you scan a QR code and it goes straight to your WeChat account. All of that just becomes kind of normal. It's kind of mundane. People don't really think about it anymore. But it works because the whole ecosystem is in place. Because if it was just the QR code and maybe you got to a website, well, that's what we're doing now. And then we kind of stopped there. Whereas they just kind of, they square the circle and all of a sudden you've got this wonderful chain. So they're at this point now where they're kind of at the end. They all started online. The QR code is bringing them closer and closer and closer to offline. And so a lot of these large social brands, what they're starting to do is they're speaking to the retail in China, because there is still physical retail. There's still department stores and so on. There's just not nearly as many of them. And they're starting to either align themselves with them or acquire them. And what they basically want to do is create a system where you can go almost anywhere and you can scan a code and buy, whether it's a physical thing, whether it's a coffee. And if it's a coffee, you'll get it right away. If it's a washing machine, somebody will deliver it. Or you order a washing machine online, and if you don't like it, you can return it to the store down the street. I mean, they're basically trying to do the round trip so that it doesn't matter where you start, it doesn't matter where you end up, and it's all connected. And so what these brands are doing and what the consumers are kind of living is they're not just leapfrogging desktop, they're not just leapfrogging finance or retail. It's kind of like they're in this giant rapid prototype of the future. And part of this really is scale, right? So when you just even look at the numbers here, PayPal has 25 billion mobile transactions in 2013. Alibaba had 150 billion. And that was just a few years ago. I mean, the scale and the growth is just so much more. They can basically prototype things so much faster. And so from a consumer perspective, offline, online, mobile, I mean, it's kind of all the same. Why call it anything in some ways? It's all become irrelevant where it is. They don't have the mental baggage we have. They certainly don't have the systemic baggage of the big financial system and all of these things. They can kind of ignore what's normal, and they can just make stuff up. And so I'll give you one last example to finish off. Some of these things that people think up, at first glance you think, well, how is this ever going to work? But I think that's what's really beautiful is they can experiment with so much stuff that whereas we're very much weighed down, we often, we want to think about it and talk about it forever because we have all these systems in place that have been here for 50 years and you don't want to hurt those, right? So this is La Moda. It's a brand that operates out of Russia. They do e-commerce. They do lovely, lovely clothing and things for women. And the problem in Russia, so every country has a constraint or two, and so the constraint in Russia is poor postal infrastructure. Another side constraint is not very much trust in using credit cards, and part of it is putting your information online isn't really something people like to do. So, so they decided to try something new. How can they get stuff to people more efficiently, and how can they sell more stuff, right? So what they do is they send their sales assistants, so you buy something online, and then they will send somebody to your door because you're paying at the door because it's a market where cash on delivery is quite popular. So they will send the person with the package to your door, and then the person brings extra stuff. And so they might bring a pair of shoes that goes with the pants you bought, or they might bring a purse or whatever, right? If you bought an iPhone, maybe they'll bring a Mac. That would be a pretty good upsell. And so they let you try it. They give you 15 minutes so you can try it, and you can try the other stuff. If you don't like it, you can return it. Well, actually, it's not even really a return because you haven't paid for it yet. So they're trying to kind of hack it. And when I first heard about this, it was about 2 years ago, and I thought, this is kind of neat, but it's probably not going to scale. I mean, how could this really, really work? And since then, I was actually reading just this morning that Jumia, the African large marketplace that I was talking about, they are doing this in Africa quite extensively now. Seems to be working. And in China, they're also doing it quite a bit, and they actually call it a mobile fitting room, because basically people bring things to your house and you try it on. And so it seems completely crazy. I mean, how you've got these people walking around with stuff you've ordered that you haven't paid for, plus extra stuff. I mean, how could this work? But you try it, right? And as it turns out, then you tweak it and you see if it works. So there's all these crazy things being tried. Some of them are more risky than others. Some of you may have already seen this example in Korea. In the subway, they basically paste a supermarket onto the wall, and every product has a QR code, and you can just scan things on your way while you're waiting for the subway. And then by the time you get home at night, it's been delivered to your house. Some of these things are more gimmicky than others. This is probably the most gimmicky one, but it's also really, really fun. I mean, you think about ways to introduce a brand, right? This is a supermarket. It's an offshoot of Walmart in China. And what they did is they launched about 1,000 virtual reality branches. And what they did is they positioned them in famous tourist sites. So imagine, you were to go to the Eiffel Tower in France, and if you stood in front of the Eiffel Tower in just the right spot, you would be in a grocery store. So you could take out your app and you could buy something. And then if you weren't in the right spot, you wouldn't be in the grocery store anymore. And it's silly, but it's a way of thinking, okay, how can we hack physical with online and turn it into something that people can respond to and that might grow the business? So when you start to kind of put all these things together, there's so much new technology, and there's so many ways that things that don't really make sense to us, poor Amazon is still desperately trying to properly test its drone delivery and all that. It's quite possible that some of these services will take off, no pun intended, much more quickly in emerging economies, just simply because there isn't the infrastructure, there might not be the regulatory systems, there's nobody to ask, you just try it. And then you start combining things, and you can see, okay, well, you could have drones, they could drop something at your door, then they could wait for you. I don't know. Some of it doesn't make sense, but it starts to become really interesting when you think of ways to combine all these concepts. So, the rise of mobile and the internet, it's already changed our world beyond recognition, and we really don't know what's going to happen. There's a lot of things we think might happen, but we never really know. I think what we do know, though, is that the opportunities in the future will be much more global than they've ever been. And so to meet all of these challenges and to compete in this marketplace, I think it's really important that we all remember that things that might seem futuristic to us, they might merely seem new and practical to other people. And I'll leave you with a really nice quote from The Economist. It says, "To Westerners, mobile banking is a new way of doing something old, but to many Africans, it's the obvious way of doing something new." So, thank you very much.